My name's Brandon, one of the pastors here, and invite you to keep your Bibles open to Matthew 7. Our passage this morning begins with what is quite possibly one of the most famous verses in the Sermon on the Mount itself. Judge not, right? And it's famous not just for Christians. If there's one verse you might hear a non-Christian quote to you, this very well could be it, right? Judge not. Don't tell me how to live or what to do. Don't look down on me for what I do. Jesus says, judge not. And what's often intriguing to me, or particularly intriguing to me right now, is as popular as that sentiment is, right? That none of us should be judging one another. We're also living today in a world that has been exploding with what we call cancel culture, right? And when you think about cancel culture, that's inherently judgmental. Like, you're transgressing some standard or crossing some line that a particular tribe, whether the right or the left, everybody does this, that says if you cross that line, you are now judged. You're canceled. You are no longer worthy of association or sometimes even employment, right? And so for all of the ways we might point out the hypocrisy of those two things kind of being popular at the same time, what's interesting to me is that we have this collective aversion to judgmentalism, and yet we cannot escape the fact that judgment is still necessary. Like, we don't like being judged, but we also know that standards still matter, right? Anything goes as a very short runway. And so what do we do when we observe someone who's doing something they shouldn't be doing, right? When we observe wrongdoing or sin in the life of someone else, especially for members of God's kingdom, for those who belong to Christ, what should we do when we see someone else falling short? That's what Jesus invites us to wrestle with here in these verses, the beginning of chapter 7. So much of the Sermon on the Mount has held before us the beauty of the virtues of God's kingdom, the particular way of life that Christ calls his followers to. And we've seen him identify what those virtues are at the beginning of chapter 5. And then we've watched Christ apply those virtues to different parts of life, to Israel's law and the quest for true righteousness at the end of chapter 5, and then to religious practices like prayer and fasting in chapter 6, and then to daily life and what are we going to eat, what are we going to drink at the end of chapter 6. So much of the beauty of the virtues of the kingdom has been held before us, but there's something that happens when we start to be convinced of that beauty, when we start to actually maybe make some progress walking with Jesus and we're putting these virtues into practice and we get really excited and passionate about them, when that happens, we start to notice a little bit more when those virtues are absent in the lives of others. The deeper our passion for Christ's kingdom becomes, the more aware we become of when others fall short of those virtues, of those standards. And with that awareness comes the temptation then to look down on those who aren't quite measuring up or keeping the standards, who aren't maybe as far along as I am. So what do I do when I see someone else falling short, when I see sin in somebody else's life? What do we do with that? Again, that's what Jesus invites us to wrestle with as he calls us to the way of wisdom. We need wisdom to know what to do when we see others fall short. Now, the passage itself divides pretty neatly into two sections, in verses 1 to 5, and then verse 6 kind of by itself. And these these two sections might seem to be unrelated at first. You know, verses 1 to 5, it's obviously a lot longer. Lots of repetition in there. Verse 6 is a single verse. It's pretty unique in its content. But they share a common idea, this application of a standard. So in verses 1 to 5, that standard is being misapplied. In verse 6, it's pretty much missing. So there's this common idea, but more than that, they address a common situation. What do I do when I see sin in somebody else's life? And we'll start with verses 1 to 5, where Jesus talks about spotting sin in the life of a fellow believer. Spotting sin in the life of a fellow believer. That Jesus is, in these first 5 verses, addressing when you see sin among a fellow Christian. That's his point here is clear by the repetition of the word brother. So 3 times he talks about brother. When you see your brother, when you say to your brother, that's family language. That's the language that the scriptures use to talk about the family of God, those who belong to the kingdom of Christ, who are in him through faith, and who then together through our union with Jesus call on our Father who is in heaven. So we're talking about sin within the kingdom, within those who belong to the kingdom. What do you do when you see sin in your brother or sister's life? Well, Jesus' answer is very simple. Do not judge. Judge not. Great. What in the world does that mean? All right, what does that mean? Well, first, let's talk about what it doesn't mean. Jesus is not saying there's no longer any standard for right and wrong. Whatever you do, it doesn't matter. Anything goes. He's not giving us license to justify sin. Nor is he saying that we should never correct anyone or never speak into someone else's life when we see wrong. Though that's often how that verse is understood and applied, we know that can't be what it means if you look at the context. So, for starters, right in this very section of verse 5, if Jesus were saying that having a speck in your eye is no big deal, having a sin in your life, that's no big deal, if that was his point, he wouldn't be giving instructions on how to carefully remove it, right? So he's talking about sin is still being a problem. Or in verse 6, Jesus calls us for discernment, right? He calls us to discernment. And in fact, he goes so far as to refer to some people as dogs and pigs. That sounds a little judgy, right? Or you look later in the chapter, verses 15 to 20. Jesus warns us about identifying he warns us against false teachers and being able to tell the difference between the kind of fruit that comes from a life and doctrine that is sick or one that comes from what is healthy. And so all of that requires making judgments of some sort, right? And we could add to that all sorts of other comments in the New Testament that call on the people of God to make judgments relative to sin. You know, Galatians 1:8 and 9, and 1 Corinthians 5:5, and there's others. So Jesus is not saying that sin no longer matters, or that we should ignore it when we see it in the lives of others. Rather, what he's saying, when he says do not judge, he seems to be saying 2 things. First, you are not the ultimate judge of your fellow believers. You are not the ultimate judge of your fellow believers. As Paul says in Romans 14, why do you pass judgment on your brother? Or why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. That's his job, not yours. So that's the first thing that he's saying. And then second, you are not exempt from the standards that you apply to others. You are not exempt from the standards that you apply to others. And that's his point in verses 2 to 4. For with the judgment that you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure that you use, it will be measured to you. And then he illustrates that by somebody judging someone else with a little speck of sawdust in their eye while they've got a big log sticking out of their own. So what Jesus is saying here, what he's correcting here is not the idea of sin or the concept of sin, but rather a critical and hypocritical spirit. Jesus is correcting a critical and hypocritical spirit among those who belong to his kingdom. And the picture he paints here is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, it's a picture of a Christian with a magnifying glass before one eye, kind of carefully examining all the other Christians, looking for any sign of impurity or imperfection that I might pounce on and point out, all the while they have a telephone pole sticking out of their other eye. Right? That's how goofy this picture is. They're guilty of the very thing they're looking for in others' lives. And honestly, we all know what that's like. We all do that at different times and in different ways. When we're overly eager to point out somebody else's flaws because we feel better when they look bad, right? We happily dole out our criticism, but when then somebody starts to kind of put some of that criticism back on us, we get defensive. We get defensive immediately. Or when we can only see the wrong in somebody, but we never ever comment on what they do well, right? We're offended by their failures, but guilty of the exact same things. And the irony here, and it's a tragic irony, we're so passionate. As we see the virtues of the kingdom and the value and beauty of it, we become so passionate about the virtues of the kingdom that we stop upholding them in order to get others to uphold them. Right? We become merciless to anybody who would withhold mercy. Like it doesn't make sense, but that's what we do. That's what we do. So where does that come from? Where does that come from? That critical spirit, that hypocritical pattern. It comes from what is perhaps best described as gospel amnesia. Gospel amnesia. We have forgotten the good news of Christ. We've forgotten the good news. We've forgotten the fact that it was while we were still sinners that Christ died for us. It wasn't after we cleaned our lives up and figured it all out. And it was while we were still sinners that our place in God's family and our power to keep his word does not come from what we do for God, but from what he has done for us. We've forgotten the good news. How else can I withhold mercy from someone unless I have forgotten the mercy that God has lavished on me? It's gospel amnesia. And so what's the way forward? What's the way forward when I see a fellow brother or sister in sin? I can't just ignore that or simply excuse it, but neither am I free from it. So what do? We need wisdom. We need wisdom. Wisdom to know what to do. More specifically, we need the wisdom that comes from that gospel that we so easily forget. The wisdom of the gospel reminds us that sin really is sinful, and that grace really is sufficient to deal with that sin. That both of those things are true at the same time. It's sufficient to deal with the sin in my life and the sin in my brother or sister's life. Paul puts it this way in 1 Timothy 1:15-16, this trustworthy saying that Christ came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the foremost. I'm the biggest problem in this scenario. But I received mercy for this reason, that in me as the foremost, Jesus Christ might display his perfect patience as an example to those who are to believe in him for eternal life. The gospel gives us the wisdom we need to both be honest and humble about our sin. Honest that it really is bad and it needs to be addressed. But humble to say, and I'm dealing with it. I'm dealing with it too. I'm guilty too. And so what does that look like more specifically? To help a fellow brother or sister when we see sin in their life. Well, first, start with yourself. That's the first step. Start with yourself. The way of wisdom when you spot sin in a fellow believer's life is to start with yourself. If you look again at verse 5. You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. How many of our attempts to help or correct others have backfired because we lacked credibility. We were getting on them for something that they saw us doing also, right? We're so focused on the wrongdoing of the other that we don't realize our own sin. It's interesting, whenever I've done marriage counseling, it takes about 3 or 4 sessions till we can get to the point where either spouse is actually willing and able to work on their own sin. Like the first 3 sessions are always all about what the other person is doing wrong, right? Because that's what we see. That's how we operate. And what happens then, when we're just focused on the other person's wrong, is that we're no longer a credible source of correction to each other. Because if this was really about sin, you'd be wanting to deal with your stuff too, not just focus on mine. Right? We lack credibility because we share the guilt. But the wisdom of the gospel reminds us that none of us have arrived. None of us. I may see sin in your life, but I too have need of repentance. I'm in the fight with you. And notice what that does, that posture. I'm no longer up here looking down on you for dropping the ball, or over here looking back wondering if you're ever going to catch up. Instead, I'm right here with you in the fight, shoulder to shoulder, fighting for holiness and against sin. It levels the playing field. Starting with yourself brings the repentance necessary to see your brother or sister's sin clearly and the humility to actually be helpful for them. So when I see sin in my brother or sister's life, before I say something to them, I need to ask myself, am I doing this too? Or where am I dropping the ball in my own life? And if so, how do I need to grow so that I can then actually be helpful to them? So that's the first step. Start with yourself, but then, armed with that humility and that mercy and that love and repentance of the gospel, then we're actually able to be helpful. And so I'm ready for number 2, to deal gently with your brother or sister. Deal gently with your brother or sister. The ultimate goal in verse 5 is to help them see and remove the speck. Again, if you just leave that in there for too long, that eye is going to start to get infected and fester. We cannot ignore sin. We need to help them get it out, but we need to do that with gentleness. As Paul says in Galatians 6, brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. So how do I do that? How do I do that? Especially if they don't respond with the same gentleness that I'm trying to approach them with. What if they get mad? What if they blow up at me for pointing something out? Even if I've done all of the work to work on myself first. Well, they might. That might happen, right? Hopefully, the gospel of Jesus will soften their hearts enough that they will want that correction, right? Every Christian should want to know if I'm doing something wrong or that dishonors Jesus. We should want to hear that input from one another. But the reality is, when we hear that input, we often do get defensive. Our guard goes up. We get defensive. And so how do I help them see it? Again, we need wisdom. We need wisdom from the Lord. We need the wisdom to know the person well enough of what's actually going to help them see their sin. Maybe it's being bold and direct, and that's what gets through to them. Maybe it's asking questions rather than telling them what's going on. Allow them that self-discovery process. Maybe it's telling a story to illustrate what's going on. You think of the prophet Nathan in 2 Samuel 12, where David is in deep sin, and Nathan comes to him and tells this story about a lamb being stolen and so on and so forth in order to get the point across that, David, you're the man. Maybe it's reading the Word together. Maybe it's encouraging others, encouraging them to ask others to speak into their life. Don't just listen to my voice. Talk to some others. See if they're seeing what I'm seeing. Maybe it means counseling and mediation. There's no shame in that. It always means prayer. It always means prayer. In fact, if you keep going through the Sermon on the Mount, the next section is going to start by talking about prayer. And it always means applying the gospel of Jesus to their lives. Applying the gospel of Jesus. It's the gospel that frees us to see sin clearly and be honest about it because we have an adequate solution for it in Jesus. I don't have to pretend because Christ has dealt with it. So it frees me to be honest, and it gives me the strength to actually address it, to actually repent from that sin. In Titus 2, we're told that it's the grace of God that has appeared, bringing salvation for all people and training us to renounce ungodliness. The gospel of God's grace teaches us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions and instead to live self-controlled, upright lives. We need the wisdom of the gospel. And so what do we do with the sin that we see in the lives of our fellow believers? We apply the wisdom of the gospel first to deal humbly with ourselves and then gently with them. That's what Christ instructs us. But what about when we spot sin in the life of a non-believer? You know, when the person we're interacting with, they don't know Jesus, they're not a follower of Christ, and yet I see this sin in their life that's messing things up. What do I do in that situation? Well, this is what Jesus addresses much more briefly and rather cryptically or puzzlingly in his little proverb in verse 6. Do not give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you. What in the world is Jesus talking about? Like, that verse has always puzzled me. And I don't think I'm alone in that. Is Jesus saying some people are just too far gone, too rotten to even preach the gospel to? Is he saying don't bother with those who are so violently opposed to the gospel? Or is he telling us to be sensitive with how we give them the gospel? Or is this simply a cryptic way of telling us to be discerning, right? Don't be judgmental, but don't be a fool either. And I've heard all of those suggestions over the years, and it's a puzzling verse, and it's a good reminder that sometimes there are verses in Scripture that are just really hard to understand. And we do our best with humility to make sense of them. But to understand this one, to do our best with this verse, we need to understand, first, what is Jesus talking about when he says dogs and pigs? And then second, what does he mean by holy things and pearls? And it's helpful to remember that while we think of dogs as cuddly pets, and even sometimes pigs, my sister-in-law had a potbelly pig for a pet, that was not the predominant view in the ancient world of those creatures. You did sometimes see domesticated dogs. You know, in Matthew 15, there's a reference to a dog in the house, but that's actually a different word than the one here. Generally speaking, dogs were wild scavengers, right? They were dangerous. And pigs were pigs, right? Filthy, unclean to God's people Israel. But in terms of the metaphor here, so that's the reputation of those animals. In terms of the metaphor that Jesus is using, it's most likely that he is referring to people outside the kingdom of God. Those who do not recognize Jesus as king and do not trust him as Savior. He's talking about non-believers. Elsewhere in the New Testament, the label dog is attributed to Gentiles and to false teachers and to those who are shut out from the eternal city. Which, you think about it, makes sense when you compare it to the emphasis on brother in verses 1 through 5. Brother, 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 and now dogs and pigs in verse 6. You're talking about believers and now non-believers. Which sounds kind of harsh when you think about it. Jesus calling people dogs and pigs. Maybe you find yourself in that category, that you're not a believer in Jesus and you're kind of exploring Christianity, and now Jesus is calling you a dog and a pig. Stick with me and see what he's saying here. The picture Jesus paints here is not about insulting outsiders, but illustrating their spiritual condition. He's illustrating their spiritual condition. What is an animal consumed with or concerned about? This world and this life, what's right in front of them. That is all they're concerned. When we're getting our kids up and ready for school in the morning, our dog Riley, she will come and just plant herself by the dog dish. And she's waiting for breakfast, right? And if we don't notice her sitting there, she'll grunt or whatever to get our attention so that she'll get her breakfast. Because that's her agenda for the day. I'm going to eat, then I'm going to sit on the couch and watch the world go by while the kids are at school and parents are at work. And then I'm going to eat some more. And it's just this world. She's not thinking about God. She's not thinking about eternity. She's thinking about this. Such is the spiritual perception of the non-believer, only focused on what's right here. This is how Asaph describes himself. When in Psalm 73, Asaph was wrestling and he had almost come to the conclusion that following God was a waste of his time because all of the wicked people had all the prosperity and all of the fun, and he had kept his hands clean in vain. And then he realizes when he was thinking that way, this is how he describes himself. He says, I was brutish and ignorant. I was like a beast toward you. I was only thinking about my earthly situation, and I had lost sight of eternity. That's the spiritual perception of an animal. And so in contrast to the believers in verses 1 to 5, those inside the kingdom, Jesus now refers to non-believers in verse 6, those outside the kingdom, the spiritually blind, the dogs and pigs. But what are the holy things and pearls? So if he's dogs and pigs are non-believers here, what are the holy things and the pearls? The most common understanding is that this is a reference to the gospel of the kingdom. And if you keep reading in Matthew and you get to chapter 13, Jesus uses another parable there where he talks about the pearl of great price. And there it is clearly a reference to Jesus and his kingdom. And so while that's a possible reading, that is definitely a possible reading, I think it's far more likely that Jesus is using this picture of holy things and pearls in a more general way to refer to the kind of correction that we give to those who are in sin. So in other words, I don't think he changes the subject after verse 5 from what do we do when we see sin to evangelizing the lost. I think he's still talking about what do we do when we see sin. Now it's, there it was sin among believers, now it's sin among non-believers. So think of it this way. The gospel-saturated correction that we might offer to one another within the kingdom to help us repent from sin, that is a treasure. That is sacred and beautiful and holy. And yet, if you take that same correction and give it to a non-believer who does not know Jesus, that is as inedible to them as a pearl before a pig. They can't eat that. They can't digest that. If I put pearls in my dog's dish in the morning, that's just, that's not going to go well, right? Because of their spiritual position, they have their spiritual condition, they have no concept of the value of that kind of heavenly wisdom. That wisdom that's so rich to us is so opaque. And so therefore, since it doesn't help them with what they're hungry for, they're just as likely to get angry and turn on you. As Tim Keller puts it here, he says, at least you're edible, right? And that's, you think about it, that's not hard to see in the world. Trying to correct a non-believer's behavior, how often does that backfire in the world, right? You point out to a colleague or a classmate, they're cutting corners. You're cutting corners. Stop that. And then rather than change their behavior, you become their enemy, right? Which makes sense, right? If this is all there is, if there's no sense of God above or eternity beyond, and it's just like this, well, of course I'm going to get rid of anybody who's in my way. That makes perfect sense. Our correction is indigestible. Or take sexual morality. There was a time in our culture when common sexual ethics were strongly influenced by biblical sexual ethics. That time is no longer. And so what happens today, if you tell an unmarried couple who does not know Jesus, stop living together, or stop sleeping together, or if you tell someone who's attracted to the same sex, don't pursue those passions, if you give them that pearl, what will happen? They're going to choke on it, right? At best, they'll spit it out and ignore you. At worst, they'll turn and attack. You bigot. How dare you? You're canceled, right? And why should we be surprised when that happens? Why do we expect non-Christians to live as Christians and then get upset when they don't? Don't give dogs what is holy. Don't throw your pearls to pigs. Save your moral corrections for the members of the kingdom, those who actually have the Spirit of God and the grace of the gospel to truly repent. That's what Christ is telling us here. So does that mean that we just ignore an unbeliever's sin? No. Or that we shouldn't speak out against the dangers of sin? Absolutely not. There is a place for that warning. There is a place for speaking prophetically to the world. But imagine for a moment that we actually convince a non-believer to stop sinning. What have they gained? They might be a happier pig. They're still a pig. We may have given them something of earthly value, and that's not nothing, but it changes nothing for eternity. The greatest need for a non-believer is not to be a cleaner pig or a more obedient dog, but to be transformed from a pig to a person, spiritually speaking, from a dog to a disciple. They need to be born again and made new through faith in Christ. That's what they need. And so spending my time and energy trying to correct the behavior of a non-believer who doesn't know Jesus, the same way that I might help a fellow Christian and speak into their lives, not only is that an exercise in futility, I actually end up bearing witness to a false gospel. I accidentally end up preaching works instead of grace. The solution to your problem is to stop doing this, as opposed to, you need Jesus. He's for you. And so what do I do when I spot sin in the life of a non-believer? Maybe it's a sibling, a child, a parent, a colleague, a neighbor, someone I love deeply, and I see them stuck, entrenched in the sin that is destroying their life, and I just want them to stop it. What do I do? We need wisdom. We need wisdom first to recognize their spiritual condition to discern what they truly need, not correction for their behavior, but conversion to Jesus. We need wisdom to give them Jesus in a way they can digest. Wisdom that begins once more with prayer. That's the first thing. Again, it is no coincidence as Jesus is talking about this, the next subject he's going to bring up is prayer. Ask and it shall be given. Pray for God to open their eyes spiritually. Pray for God to help them see the world as it truly is, not this emptiness and this rat race of just trying to get whatever I can out while I still have time, but to see the world as by God and for God, that he is the one who made us, that he is the one who saves us, that he is the one before whom we will all stand in the end. To see the world as it is, to open spiritual eyes, we pray. And then second is patience. Patience. While there is an urgency to the gospel, we must give people time and space to digest what they're hearing, to think about it. So don't be pushy, right? Nobody's ever been bullied into the kingdom of God. Don't be pushy. Don't get ahead of yourself. Don't make this about winning an argument. Don't get ahead of God's Spirit. Be patient, even when his timetable is not yours. So prayer and patience. Number 3, focus on Jesus. Focus on Jesus. Remember, the gospel is not what we do for God. It's what he has done for us through Christ. And so focus your conversation not on whether this non-believing friend is keeping the virtues of the kingdom, but on whether or not they know the King. That's the focus. Focus not on their behavior, but on Christ's behavior for them. Show them the beauty of Jesus. Show them the beauty of Christ, who in his love stepped into his own creation, who became like us in order to save us, whom the Father sent not to condemn the world, but to save the world, and who paid the ultimate price to do it. Focus on Jesus. And then 4, trust God for the results. Trust God for the results. We cannot control what somebody does with the message of the gospel, as much as we would love to. We cannot control that. That's God's department. He calls us to pray, and he calls us to proclaim, but the results are in his hands. He alone can open blind spiritual eyes and give new life. But take heart. He alone can open blind spiritual eyes and give new life. So trust him for results. And we're going to talk more about this last part, this call to personal evangelism. We'll talk more about that in January, actually, as we do a short series on being ambassadors for Christ. But when I spot sin in the life of a non-believer, it's not about correcting their behavior. It's about giving them Jesus through prayer and patience, through keeping Jesus the center of the conversation and trusting God for the results. The virtues of God's kingdom are a treasure. They are sweet and holy. They are beautiful. They are essential to walking with Christ. Knowing what to do when people fall short of those virtues requires wisdom. Wisdom, humility, discernment. Wisdom to apply the gospel of Jesus to a fellow brother or sister, first dealing humbly with our own sin and then gently with theirs. And wisdom to preach the gospel of Christ to non-believers that they might know him. And my prayer is that the beauty of Christ would be displayed as we exercise that wisdom, walking with him together. Let's pray. Gracious Father, Lord, we confess, as we do so often, our utter need for you. Lord, we need your wisdom to see ourselves clearly, to see our friends clearly. We need the wisdom that reminds us of the sufficiency of your grace. And so, Lord, would you fill us with that wisdom in our relationships at home, in our conversations with loved ones, in our interactions here in the church, in our relationships and engagement with the world around us. Lord, would we walk with a wisdom that knows how to uphold your kingdom virtues with the grace of the gospel. Lord, would you do it among us in Jesus' name? Amen.